On August 20th, 1672, Johan de Witt went to a prison in The Hague to see his brother Cornelis. A few hours later, both men were dead. A crowd dragged them outside, killed them, hung their bodies upside down, and cut them apart. Pieces of their bodies were taken away and sold, and eyewitnesses even reported that some were eaten. That is a fairly extreme way for a political career to end, especially because Johan had spent nearly 20 years as the most powerful politician in the Dutch Republic, and Cornelis had been a national hero. Just 5 years earlier, Cornelis had joined the Dutch raid on the Medway, where the Dutch fleet sailed into English waters and humiliated the English navy. When he came home, his city celebrated him and commissioned a huge painting of the victory. In 1672, rioters destroyed that painting. Soon after, they killed Cornelis too. So how do you go from putting a man in a victory painting to tearing him apart in the street? To understand that, we need to go back to when Johan's political system still seemed to be working. The Dutch Republic had no king, and for years the country had argued over how much power should belong to the House of Orange. Johan and his allies wanted the Republic run without giving too much power back to the Orange family, while Orange supporters wanted their prince back at the center of Dutch politics. That prince was the young William of Orange, the future William III. For most of Johan's career, keeping William out did not look like a terrible idea. The Dutch Republic was rich, its merchants traded across the world, and its navy was one of the strongest in Europe. After the Dutch humiliated England at the Medway in 1667, Johan had a pretty easy answer to anyone asking why the country needed an orange prince again. Look around. Things were going pretty well. Then came 1672. France attacked the Dutch Republic, England attacked too, and Münster and Cologne joined in from the east. The land war went badly almost immediately, with cities and fortresses falling so quickly that Utrecht and much of the Eastern Republic were soon in enemy hands. For a country that had spent years feeling rich and powerful, this was terrifying. The Dutch still remember 1672 as the disaster year. And once the country started falling apart, Johan had a very obvious problem. He had been the most powerful man in the system while everything was going well, so when everything suddenly went wrong, people knew exactly where to look. But losing a war still does not explain why somebody ends up hanging upside down outside a prison. For that to happen, military failure had to become something much more personal. It had to become betrayal. Political pamphlets flooded the Dutch Republic, accusing Johan and his allies of weakening the army, favoring France, stealing money, and deliberately keeping William of Orange away from power. Some went even further and claimed that the de Witt government had basically sold the country to its enemies. Most people had no way to know why the defenses were collapsing, so the pamphlets gave them a much simpler answer. The de Witts had betrayed them. And that answer came with an obvious replacement. William of Orange. The argument was no longer just that Johan's government had made mistakes. It was becoming that the de Witts had betrayed the country, while the prince they had kept out might be the man who could save it. Once people started thinking that way, the violence came quickly. On June 21st, 4 men attacked Johan while he was walking home and badly wounded him. He survived, but one of the attackers was later defended in pro-Orange propaganda. Someone had just tried to kill the most powerful politician in the country, and part of the political world was already willing to treat the attacker like a patriot. Meanwhile, William of Orange was becoming more powerful as the war got worse. Pressure to restore him became overwhelming, and he returned to the center of Dutch politics. Johan resigned. That should have ended the fight. It didn't. Now his brother Cornelis had his own problem. A man named Willem Tichelaar accused Cornelis of trying to arrange the murder of William of Orange. Cornelis denied the accusation and still refused to confess after being arrested and tortured, so the court stripped him of office and sentenced him to banishment rather than death. But by then, many people outside the prison did not see Cornelis as a politician who had lost. They saw him as a traitor, and a traitor, in their eyes, deserved more than retirement somewhere abroad. On August 20th, Johan went to the prison to see his brother, putting both de Witt brothers in the same place at exactly the wrong moment. A crowd gathered outside, but the crowd itself was only half the problem. The city militia was supposed to keep order, yet many of those armed men had been pulled into the same anti-de Witt politics. There is a story from this period about a city official greeting members of the militia and basically being told that the old hierarchy no longer mattered because they were in charge now. That is the dangerous part. The prison still had guards, but the men responsible for keeping order no longer really wanted to protect the de Witt brothers. Once that happened, there was not much standing between them and the crowd. The brothers were dragged outside and killed. Then the violence continued after death. Their bodies were stripped, hung upside down, and mutilated. People cut off pieces, some were sold, and eyewitnesses reported that parts were eaten. That last detail is the part everyone remembers. Of course it is. Cannibalism tends to steal the headline, but it was not the reason the de Witts died. By then, months of war and political fighting had already changed what people thought these two men were. First, the country suffered a military collapse so fast that the government stopped looking competent. Then William became the obvious alternative. Then political propaganda turned defeat into betrayal and gave that betrayal two names. Johan was attacked. William returned to power. Johan resigned. Cornelis was accused of plotting to kill William. And finally, even the men responsible for keeping order stopped standing between the brothers and the crowd. By the time Johan walked into that prison, the most important thing had already happened. The country had changed its mind about who the de Witts were. 5 years earlier, Cornelis was the man who had helped humiliate England. His city had paid for a huge painting to celebrate him. In 1672, rioters destroyed that painting because the old version of Cornelis no longer fit the story people wanted to believe. Now he was a traitor. And once enough people believed that, killing him could start to feel less like murder and more like punishment. There is one very neat ending we could give this story. We could say William III secretly planned the whole thing. His supporters certainly benefited from the collapse of the de Witts, and the Orange movement attacked them relentlessly. But there is no solid evidence that William personally ordered the brothers to be killed. And the real story does not need a secret order anyway. By then, war had terrified the country. William had become the obvious alternative. Propaganda had turned defeat into betrayal. And even the men responsible for keeping order were changing sides. So when Johan went to see Cornelis on August 20th, he was not just walking into a prison surrounded by an angry crowd. He was walking into a country where the story had already flipped. 5 years earlier, Cornelis was a hero. Now, both brothers were traitors in the eyes of the crowd. And that was enough to get them killed.